good evening, and good morning, and good afternoon, wherever you are. And also happy Eid Mubarak for people of Islamic belief. My name is Kando Yoshihiro, today's coordinator, and I'm a chief news editor of BuzzFeed Japan, an internet news service in Japan. Today, and thank you for gathering today. Today, we'd like to discuss about this 10 years of ongoing conflict and also humanitarian situation in Syria. Some people may wonder why I'm sitting here and who you are. Actually, I was a correspondent of a Japanese newspaper to the Middle East since 2004. So I've been covering since Syria for around 15 or 16 years. And from the very beginning of this conflict, March 2011, I have been watching and covering. And I've been to both Assad regime area and also opposition controlled area as well. And I lost some of my personal friends as well. So I may be a part of this. And I believe that there is no winner in this 10 years of ongoing warfare in Syria and conflict. Everybody has lost, including today's panelist. And we'd like to think how to change this trend, how to make a difference, how to assist people in Syria and give them hope. Thank you very much. Thank you again. And now we'd like to introduce our speakers and panelists. Okay. Before going that, we'd like to give you a basic understanding of Syria. And for the benefit of majority of attendees today, I will switch my language from English to Japanese. So for those who speak English, please click translation button of your Zoom. Thank you. Okay. ここから日本語でご説明します。これが中東と北アフリカの地図です。で、シリアというのはトルコ、イラク、それからレバノン、それからパレスチナとイスラエルに囲まれた地域で、そこで、その周辺国を巻き込んで、大きな紛争が続いているということになります。次お願いします。で、基本的な知識、基本的なデータなんですけども、シリアというのは実は国としてはですね、極めて新しいんです。独立が1946年、つまり日本の戦後よりもシリアの近代史の方が短い。これが今回の紛争の一つの遠因でもあります。ちなみにシリアはフランス領から独立しました。その前はオスマン帝国の一部でした。で、シリアは政情がずっと安定しなかったんですけれども、1963年にバース島がクーデター、彼らは革命と言いますが、起こして政権を掌握します。その中でも権力構想が続いてたんですけども、1970年にハーフェズ・アサドという、今大統領のお父さんですけども、父親がクーデターを起こして完全に実権を掌握します。そして2000年、このハーフェズが亡くなったことによって、今のバシャール・アサド大統領が権力を継承します。で、一頃はシリアの民主化と言われた時期もあったんですけれども、なかなかそうはいかず、今に至っていると。で、すいません、ポピュレーション、字を間違ってしまったんですけども、人口は大体2000万人です。今の推計です。で、民族的な分布でいうと、これはCIA ファクトブックと日本の外務省が取ったデータですけども、75% がアラブ人で、10% ほどがクルド人、それからアルメニア人等々その他が 15% いると。要するに多民族国家です。これもまた紛争の遠因の一つです。紛争が解決しない原因の一つでもあります。から宗教としてはイスラム教スンニ派が 74%、それからアラブイ派、イスマイリ派、そしてシーア派、これが合わせて大体 13% 程度。からキリスト教徒が1割程度、もう少し少ないかもしれません、今は。なぜかというと、集中的にやられたりして逃げているからです。それからドルーズ派、イスラム教ドルーズ派という、これまたイスラム教ではかなりマイノリティのセクションが 3% くらいいて、極めて複雑な民族構成であり、宗派構成である。その中でいろいろバラバラに分かれて、いろんな紛争が起きているのが今のシリアということになります。次お願いします。で、アサド体制っていうのの特徴は、アサド大統領一族はイスラム教アラウィ派の信者です。 で、それと都市部のエリートのイスラム教スンニ派、いわゆる多数派の人たちのエリートがくっついてできている政権で、基本的には軍部中心、軍部および秘密警察中心の政権です。というのは、アラウィ派というのは、長くスンニ派中心の社会で差別に苦しんできました。で、シリア社会の中で最も差別が少なく実力主義というのが軍部だったんですよ。だから独立直後からアラウィ派が次々と軍部に入って、そこで社会的な地位の上昇を果たすという動きが続きまして、バシャール・アサド氏の父のハーフェズ氏もそうやって軍部で実力を発揮して、軍部では特に空軍等はアラウィ派が中心になっていたという経緯があります。なので政権としてはいわゆる世俗主義、イスラム教を政治に適用しようとはしませんが、それはなぜかというと、軍隊は基本的に世俗主義っていうのもあるし、それでもう一つはスンニ派の多数派の独占を恐れているから、権力の民主化して、人々が宗派で政党を作ったら、アラウィ派は圧倒的に少ないので負けると思っている。なので国としては世俗主義を維持している。で、もう一つのアサド政権代々の特徴は鉄拳制裁っていう言葉、鉄拳政策って言葉、これ父親のハーベス氏が使ったんですけども、軍事政権の特徴でもあるんですが、極めて非妥協的に敵に対して立ち向かっていく。なので実は2011年、2012年ぐらいから本格化した今回の紛争なんですけども、1982年にイスラム教スンニ派組織のムスリム同胞団という、反体制組織があるんですけどね、そこが反乱を起こしたんです。1982年、中部ハマというところで。何をしたかというと、アサド政権が軍隊を送ってハマの町を砲撃して、市民もろともムスリム同胞団を、簡単に言うと皆殺しにしてしまった。その死者が数千人とも数万人とも言われてますが、今にわからない。というような事件が実際に起きています。当時はインターネットもなかったので、すぐにどこで何が起きたか全く世界的に知られない状況で、後で分かってきた。でもシリアの国民はよく知っている。だからアサド政権の、2011年までの支配の、やり方の一つが、恐怖と暴力だったのは否定できないと思います。次お願いします。で、2011年の3月に、シリアでいわゆる民主化要求デモというのが始まるんですが、それが何なのかという話をしますと、当時日本は3.11 東日本大震災の前後でかなり皆さんご関心というかご関心を持つ余裕もなかったと思うんですけど、あの頃、2011年の12月、2010年の12月の末に、まずチュニジアで青年失業とかに苦しむ青年たちが政府に対して改革を求めるデモを起こしました。それに対して政権側が、暴力的に対応したことで、それに怒った人たちがさらにデモに参加して雪だるま式に膨らんでいって、ついには1月にチュニジアのベンアリ政権、ベンアリ大統領が国外逃亡して政権が倒れたという事件が起きました。これがアラブの各地の民衆を勇気づけたんですよ。初めて民衆運動でいわゆる独裁政権、強権的な政権が倒れるというのを今生きるアラブの人々が目にした。しかもアラブの国々は人口若いんですよ。なので特に青年たちが一斉に立ち上がった。エジプトで1月25日に同じようなデモが始まりました。2月11日にはムバラク政権が倒れました。で次はおそらくシリアだろう。シリアが一番強権的だってみんな知ってるので取ろうと思ってたんですが、一方でシリアで民主化要求デモが起きたらおそらく大変なことになるだろうとも思ってた。で実際に3月に南部のデラーってところで一つの動きがあります。この右側になんか赤い文字が壁に書いてるんです。これ子どもたちがですね落書きしたんですよ、スプレーで。次はあんたの番だよドクター。ドクターっていうのは本来は名車のバシャール・アル・アサド大統領のことですね。でこの頃テレビでこういうフレーズがいろんなところで言われてたんですよ。流行語だったんですよね。そんな感じでみんながエジプトで、私が当時いたエジプトでもそうですけども、デモごっこしたりとかしてたわけです。そんな感じで子どもが落書きをした。何が起きたか。当時の地元の警察治安部隊は子どもたちの草のわけを探し出して、全員を連れて行って、殴る蹴るの暴行を加えて、 いたと。でそれに対して地元の親や、ここ部族社会でも部族が起こった。その真ん中にあるのがその傷ついた子どもの、当時流れた YouTube なんですけどね。で何をするんだって話になって抗議の輪が広がった。そういうことがまずデラーという南部の町で始まった。同時に都市部でも学生たちが民主化要求デモを始めた。でそれに対して政権側は基本的に実力行使で対抗しようとします。そして3月30日にアサド大統領が国会で演説するんですね。何って言ったかというと、外国の陰謀と衛星テレビ、アルジャジーラのことですけどの陰謀が存在すると。でシリアは敵には負けない。何を言ったかというと、民主化要求をすること自体が外国の陰謀であり国家の敵であるというふうにいきなり宣言してしまったんですよ。なのでそこから先は今皆さんミャンマーの情勢をご覧になってて、軍事政権が民主化要求デモにどんな行動で返してくるかをご覧になっていると思うんですけども、それと同様かもっとひどいものがシリアで毎日続いていったということになります。次のスライドお願いします。で、その2011年の夏ぐらいからは政権の軍や警察から離脱する人たちが出始めたんですね。これ以上やってられない。これ以上同胞に銃を向けられない。で、そういう人たちが銃を持ったまま集まって逆にデモ隊の警護をする、つまり武力に武力で対抗するという状況が生まれ始めた。それがその年の夏ぐらいからですね。それから、シリア国民評議会っていう、反体制派の中央組織となるはずの政治団体ができたりとかして、でだんだん状況が厳しくなっていきます。で2012年には2月にホムスという、シリア第3の都市で激しい戦闘が起きたりしてまして、で4月には国連が PKO を送るんですけども、さまざまな条件で丸腰だったんですよ。だから実効性がほとんどなくて6月には撤退します。自らの命も漏れない状態になった。でシリアの内戦の特徴というのはいつ始まったかがはっきりしないところがあるんですけども、一般的に日本を含めメディアはこの時に、PKO 担当だった国連事務次長のラズズ氏がシリアに視察に行って出るときにシリアは内戦状態だといった6月、これをもって、各メディアは一斉にシリアは内戦と書き始めました。でも実際にはもっと前に始まってたと思いますが、それをいつからなのかというのは未だにはっきりしません。でこの年7月にはアレッポ、これからご登壇いただくハムザ医師のご活躍なさったアレッポというシリア第2の町で激しい戦闘が始まりまして、でその翌月には日本人ジャーナリストの山本美香さんという方が殺害されます。そして2013年の8月にはダマスカス近郊のグータ地区というところで化学兵器が使われ、多くの市民が亡くなる事件が起きました。でその後いろんな勢力の、周辺国やいろんな勢力の、武器や人員やお金の介入が相次ぎまして、基本的には反体制派の後ろにトルコやサウジ、カタール、アメリカ、その他の勢力がいて、政権軍の後ろにロシア、イラン、その他の勢力がいるというおおむねの構図になり、今に至っています。次お願いします。で今どうなっているかというと、一頃2012年の夏から2013年の春ぐらいまでかなり追い詰められた政権軍はロシアとイランの加勢を得て大幅に盛り返しまして、今この地図にあるこれは2021年3月現在で BBC からちょっと取ってきたのなんですけども、この水色のところがアサド政権軍が確保している地域です。で、ウグイス色のところが、クルディッシュフォース、クルド人、さっきお伝えしました人口の 10% ぐらいのクルド人、これ北部トルコやイラクの国境地帯に集中しているんですね。そこら辺で、すでに自治を行っている。で、赤いのは何かというと、これはトルコ軍とトルコが支援する反体制派。どういうことかというと、このトルコにもクルド人がたくさんいまして、でトルコは常にクルド人のトルコからの独立運動を恐れているんです。でトルコのクルド人もシリアのクルド人も同じクルド人ですから、しかもトルコにはかつて PKK というクルド人政党がありまして、激しいトルコ独立闘争をやって、武力闘争をやって、テロ組織とも認定されている、国際的に。でその組織とこのシリアにいるクルド軍勢力っていうのは、同じだとみなして、で自国に影響を波及するのを防ぐために、トルコ軍による簡単に安全地帯、トルコのための安全地帯というのを作っているのはこの赤いところです。でいわゆる反体制派の支配地域というのはイドリブというところにある左上にある黄色いところ、 なんですが、その中にもいろんな勢力がいて、バラバラになっている。で、一方で、これ全体を今統一する展開、見込みが政権側にも、その逆の側にも、いずれにもないというのが今の現状ですね。次のページお願いします。では、具体的に今、どのような勢力がシリアにいるか、特に海外勢力、国外勢力。これはトルコの研究機関がまとまった図を持ってきたんですけども、イランの軍事拠点および検問所等々のあらゆる軍事施設が今、シリアで131カ所あります。で、ヒズボラ、これはレバノンにあるイスラム教シーア派の軍事組織なんですけども、簡単に言えばイランの別動隊です。イランからお金をもらってやっている組織なんです。それが116。トルコが114。で、ロシアが83。で、アメリカおよびその連合軍が33。少ないんですけども、これは、もともとアメリカはそれほど、人をたくさん出すよりも空爆に集中していたのが一つと、それからトランプ政権が撤退をするって出てったんですね。で、代わりに何があったかというと、その代わりイランとトルコとロシアが、アメリカが放棄した軍事拠点に入っていったっていうことで、アメリカが撤退することによってシリアが平和になったかと必ずしもそうではないというのが現実です。次お願いします。で、もう一つ、それは軍事的な問題で、では人はどうなのか、市民はどんな影響を受けたのかというと、約2000万人の人口のうち半分以上が家を失うことになりました、この10年で。国外に660万人、国内に670万人。で、先ほどお見せした通り、いくつもの勢力にシリアは支配権が分かれていて、今、そのラインを越えて移動することや人道支援をすることが極めて難しい状況にあります。そして今の推定ですけども、死者と行方不明者で50万人を超えているだろうと言われています。日本の人口が1億2000万人、6倍ですから、日本で言えば300万人、つまり太平洋戦争に匹敵する割合ですね。相当のロスです。そして今ここにあるのが、左側の地図であるのが各地にある国内避難民の避難キャンプの、数とその、人数の推計ですね。次お願いします。これが最後のスライドです。そこで問題になっているのがコロナ、COVID-19、新型コロナウイルスですね。今、こちらの、これは WHO の表なんですけども、3月で現在で、シリア、アサド政権軍支配地域が1万7000、その他もろもろ合わせると、計4万7812人の、感染者が出ていて、うち2254人が亡くなっておられると。で、日本が今のところ9月8日段階で62万6000人の症例で、トータルが1万人ちょっとの、死者数なので、死亡の比率でいうと、陽性者に対する死者の比率でいうと、日本よりも高いと。でかつ、日本は遅れていると言われながらも、今のところ300万のワクチン接種者がいますが、シリアではようやく始まったシリアコバックスという国連中心のワクチンレジームで運ばれたのが26万本。で、これ、いずれもアストラゼネカなんですけども、でうち20万本がアサド政権支配地域に、5万4000が反体制地域に運ばれまして、ただし、見ての通り、アレッポとか、逆にイドリブに関してはデータすらないので、かなり深刻な状況なんですけども、十分に治療やワクチンを行き届かせるには程遠い状況にあり、かつ、このコバックスという国連のレジームは、インド製のアストラゼネカを使うことになっているんですが、インドは今ご覧の通りの状況で、インド政府が今、インド産のワクチンの輸出を止めてしまったので、なかなかうまく進まないというところです。長くなりました。以上です。では、準備が整いましたので、ゲストスピーカーの方々のご紹介を。Now we'd like to introduce our panelists and speakers. First, we'd like to thank Dr. Hamza al-Kateab, who is a Syrian doctor and human rights activist, and also a public health advocate. Mr. Hamza, Dr. Hamza was featured in the film, Oscar-nominated film called For Summer, which was filmed and directed and produced by his wife, Ms. Watt, which was a great film, I believe. I still remember that. And from 2012 to December 2016, Dr. Hamza delivered frontline medical care for thousands of people in Aleppo, especially in eastern Aleppo, which was at that time controlled by opposition groups, and as a manager of Al-Quds Hospital. In December 2016, Dr. Hamza and his family left Aleppo and moved to London. And in 2018, they arrived in London. Now, Dr. Hamza is currently studying towards a master's degree in public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'd like to especially thank for joining us today, even during the Eid, which is one of the biggest celebration for Muslims after finishing 1 month of Ramadan. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll hear a lot from you later. And next is Dr. Tomoko Okada. She's a doctor who joins ICRC mission in South Sudan, Iraq, Yemen, Syria. And she usually works for倉敷Medical Center as a doctor. And recently, she joined medical activity in al-Hol camp in Syria, northeastern Syria, from August 2020 to March 2021. And I'm really looking forward to hear her rare and low account. Thank you very much. And she will speak to you in Japanese. And next gentleman is Mr. Filipp Speri, head of delegation of ICRC in Syria. And he has been heading this ICRC session delegation in Syria since 2019. And he has worked for ICRC since 1994 and has led some of the ICRC's largest scale field operations, such as Afghanistan and Democratic Republic of Congo. Now he is in one of the most difficult countries, which is Syria. The next gentleman is Mr. Yasir Kamaluddin. He is currently the head of mission of MSF in Syria. He has been working with MSF since 2012. And since the onset of Syrian war, he has worked with refugees from Syria in the Middle East and North African region. And he also led the on-ground implementation of medical humanitarian programs in a variety of countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Kenya. Thank you all for joining us today. And now we'd like to move on to the presentation. The first person is Mr. Speri. Mr. Speri, now the floor is yours.
Well, good day to all of you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. That's very good news. Look, very happy to be with you speaking here today from Damascus. So thank you very much, Mr. Kando, for having me in this session. Look, 10 minutes is the time I have been allotted. You very helpfully showed to all those watching the maps of Syria and the different kind of areas of control, because indeed Syria, even 10 years into this crisis and conflict, is always a very, very difficult one to understand. So it's good having these maps. It's also always an extraordinary number of actors that are in there, so never easy to explain the full picture. But again, from the ICRC point of view, it's important to note that this remains our largest operation in the world. A very large budget we have of close to $200 million, and a very, very wide range of programs that we are having here in Syria. Very large programs in the domains of assistance, economic security. More and more programs we had shifting from emergency assistance to helping Syrians to rebuild livelihoods, microeconomic initiatives. So very large programs in that sense, but also in the health sector. That's of course particularly important in this sector to note that we have very wide-ranging programs supporting, in particular, through our partner organization, which is the Syrian Arab Red Crescent Society, largely speaking, supporting the first aid in the country, but also certain health structures. We have own physical rehabilitation programs in the country. And I'll come to the next topic when I go sort of more to the northeast, including running a very important field hospital in the northeast in a famous camp. But of course, I could go on and on in the scale of activities, noting, of course, that we are the ICRC, so we work very much, for the respect of international humanitarian law, having programs there, but also in more specifically related protection programs. For example, we visit all central prisons under the government of Syria control in the country. No access to security and military detention, however, but in all the northeast, thus local self-administration of northeast, the full access to all camps and prisons there. So that's just to give a picture. I could go more into scale, but again, it's very large. To note as well, the water programs, where probably with UNICEF, the biggest actor in the water sector as well in the country, and I can go more into that in the Q&A sessions if there are questions on that. But if I share some points and reflections that are important for me at this point in time, 10 years after, the very ably described Syrian and complex conflict by Mr. Kando, I would just like to highlight that for the past months or even the year, something that has added to the complexity of the conflict. I mean, 10 years of conflict, yes, larger areas or big areas under control of the government, but still northwest, northeast, as you have seen, not yet there. Areas also, for example, in the south, where there is ongoing instability, so not a fully stabilized situation. However, arguably some stability that has added and made the country more stable. But adding to this 10 years of crisis, yes, the impact of COVID, yes, the impact of a collapse in economy in the neighboring country, Lebanon, which has heavily impacted on the situation in the country. There is also the arguable impact of restrictive measures, sanctions on Syria. So what I'm trying to allude to is an absolutely dramatic economic decline that we have seen over the past year, with people losing over 200% of their purchasing power, high inflation. And I mention this because one of the issues that we are seeing now in our very big assistance programs in the country, particularly our assistance in the water and electricity field, but also in the medical field when it comes to medical services, is that 10 years into the conflict, with the economy going down, is that these essential services are becoming weaker. And an assessment that we have made is that if, in the coming years, no larger investments are made, for example, for large power stations, the water provision, water stations, pumping stations, bigger investments are not made, including in the health sectors and others. What we have been seeing, this spread or widening of humanitarian needs, will continue. So we're looking into a situation that would be much aggravated if no larger investments are made soon. We have argued, and we have been promoting this position, to look at it really from a humanitarian perspective, as a humanitarian issue, to be able to add and work on this large infrastructures which are simply too big to fail. So this is one very important issue, just highlighting the heavy impact that on top of crisis and conflict, the big economic downturn has had for Syrians, which for many citizens is a very sad reality, a reality of little hope towards the future, having seen more stability, but actually seeing their day-to-day living conditions getting more and more difficult. So that is one big issue I wanted to flag. When I pointed out another issue that is often very much in the headlines also of international attention when it comes to Syria, is the situation in the northeast. You have described the local self-administration areas. Sometimes it's called Kurdish areas, which is of course not fully accurate, but at least it helps to describe them. And there, for over 2 years now, the situation where up to 100,000 people have been stranded in camps, in prisons in the Northeast. A big number of foreign nationals from 60, 70 countries also being held there, which of course for many countries poses the problem of what to do. These people are associated, with the fall of the Islamic State. Obviously, that doesn't mean that every person is part of that, but at least that's the association that is made. What I'm saying is that the ICRC has been very, very big in its response in camps and prisons. We visit these places. If one just takes the one example of this very big camp in the Northeast called Al-Hol camp, where you have over 60,000 people working there, the ICRC has set up a field hospital, a state-of-the-art facility for assisting medically. But also, for example, in that camp, if one just takes one of the parts of the camps where all the foreigners, up to 10,000 foreigners are located, we also have mobile clinics, we have programs in mental health, we provide assistance in replacing tents, water work, but also we have large programs in just establishing the family links between those persons and their home countries, but also those persons that have been separated, women and children, for example, separated from their fathers in prisons. This is and remains a situation when one visits, which is very dramatic. You will have seen probably ICRC statements before on this topic. What is so dramatic is that all these people, if you just take Al-Hol camp, the majority of those there are children, small children. The section where I mentioned 10,000 foreigners staying, you will have 1,500 women and the rest 8,000 children, small children, which are trapped and locked in a situation up there with very, very little hope for the future. Humanitarian assistance is one point, but there is currently really nothing to attend, to their bigger needs, education, future. The ICRC has been calling on states, on governments, as a priority to take the citizens back, to put it short, unless there are specific protection needs that would impede that. A very strong call to that, simply saying that people are stranded, the conditions are extremely difficult, they're not suitable, certainly not for children, probably one of the biggest child protection crises worldwide we see, but also for other nationals to find the way home. But meanwhile, obviously, we will have to do everything with all other humanitarian actors to tend to that specific issue. So I just wanted to highlight once again this very, very difficult specific protection issues that we are encountering in the Northeast, which is a truly unprecedented phenomenon, at least what I have seen in my more than 25 years of humanitarian career. Last point, maybe just in general, I would say that very, very strongly, over the years, the ICRC on the side of protecting healthcare, we've tried many initiatives to overcome the many impediments to providing healthcare in Syria, also when there's a conduct of hostility. I recall actually being the representative of the ICRC in New York a few years back, where together very actively with MSF, we worked on passing or helping the governments in passing a very, very important United Nations Security Council resolution on the protection of healthcare in our Conflict Security Council resolution 2286. And this was a very, very important resolution at the level of international normative statements. But again, it remains a priority issue on which we also try to see whatever we can to find practical health, practical measures on the ground to overcome any impediments to the provision of healthcare in the country. I gave the example of our work in Al-Hol camp as one specific example. So again, I could talk for hours on Syria, having been here now for 2.5 years, but I leave it with these few points I've mentioned, overview of what we're doing in many areas, the situation in the Northeast in particular, and the situation in the camps in the Northeast very specifically. So, Mr. Kando, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shiperi. Now we'll move on to Dr. Okada, who worked in this al-Hol camp. Dr. Okada, please. 岡田さん、音声がミュートです。
すみません。私は2019年8月から5ヶ月間、2020年8月から7ヶ月間、アルフルキャンプにある ICRC とシリア・アラブ・レッドクレセントが運営する病院での支援活動に参加しました。この病院は救急外来診察室、手術室、検査室と薬局を備えた約30床の救急病院です。私たちの病院が最良の医療サービスを提供しているとの評判があるようで、救急対応の必要がない患者も多く来院しました。私たちの病院では行うことができない検査、治療が必要な患者は70キロ離れた羽坂市にある病院に搬送されます。この場合、患者は保証人を持つ必要があります。保証人とは、その患者の消息が分からなくなったときに代わって弁済する人です。平常でも患者搬送の調整に時間がかかりますが、コロナ感染大流行が始まって以来、受け入れ先の病院が患者受け入れ数を制限しているため、さらに時間がかかるようになりました。準緊急の症例は数日間かかりますし、緊急性のない症例は搬送されないようでした。羽坂市内の病院を受診し、そこでは受けることができない治療、例えばがんに対する化学療法や放射線療法、狭心症に対するカテーテル治療、高度な眼科手術が必要と言われた患者は、ダマスカスや国外の医療施設に行く必要があります。ICRC としては紹介状を出すことしかできず、患者が高度医療施設を受診できるかどうかは、クルド人組織によって運営されているオペレーションデスクの判断に委ねなければなりません。シリア人の患者はダマスカスの病院を受診できる可能性があるようですが、シリア人でない患者が受診することは不可能に近いようです。私が紹介状を作成した患者の一人に、羽坂市の病院で進行乳がんの診断を受けたイラク出身40歳代の女性がいました。彼女は幼い息子さんと2人で暮らしていました。彼女は1年も前から乳房腫瘤を自覚し、何度の他の病院を受診しました。彼女によると、まともに診察してもらえずに問題ないと言われ続け、1年経過してやっと羽坂市の病院に紹介されたそうです。時すでに遅く、彼女の乳がんは手術適用がないほど進行していました。彼女は羽坂市で受けることができない化学療法と放射線療法を医師から勧められたため、紹介状を入手するため来院しました。彼女は息子さんのことをとても心配していました。彼女が救急用の紹介状を持って帰宅した後、私は彼女がどこかに搬送されたかどうかをオペレーションデスクに何度か問い合わせしましたが、情報を得ることはできませんでした。アネックスと呼ばれる場所に隔離収容されている武装勢力メンバーの家族が医療サービスを受けることは一般の避難民よりさらに困難です。アネックスの人々はキャンプ内の病院でさえ自由に受診することができません。受診するためには守衛の許可が必要です。守衛の中には彼女たちにひどいことを言ってなかなか許可を出さない人がいるようで、彼女たちが来院できるまでに何日もかかることがあるようでした。私が2回目に医療活動に参加したときに、アネックスの患者数が減少していることが問題視されました。議論の末、外科医産婦人科医、看護師が各自週1回アネックスを訪問し、受診が必要な患者がいれば受診できるように手配することが今年2月下旬から開始されました。この訪問により何人かの患者が来院できました。また、アネックスの一人の女性は、歯科治療と眼科治療が必要な人がアネックスに大勢いて、彼女はアネックスを訪問する人々に何度もその問題に取り組んでほしいとお願いしたけれども、実現していない、諦めるしかないのかと私に言いました。実際に歯の感染が原因で亡くなった女性がいました。また、メガネの度が合わなくなって一人で外出することができなくなったと訴える女性に会いました。 ICRC のアルフルキャンプの公衆衛生担当者も、この歯科と眼科の問題を何とかしたいと言っていましたが、この問題に対する取り組みが始まっているかどうかは分かりません。キャンプにいるシリア人の中には、自分の元の居住地に帰ることができる人もいます。私の滞在中に帰還する多くの人々を乗せた何台もの車がキャンプから出ていく光景を数回見ました。一方で、復興されてない元の居住地に帰っても、家も仕事もないからキャンプにとどまっている人も多くいるようです。キャンプで楽しそうにサッカーをしている子どもたちの姿をよく見かけました。キャンプ内に学校がありますが、通学している子どもの割合は少ないようです。子どもたちが将来の夢を持ち、その夢を実現できるような環境で暮らすことができる日が来ることを願っています。終わります。
Thank you very much, Dr. Okada. For your, I'd like to add some explanation about this camp. That this whole camp is in near Hasake, which is northeast of Syria, which is controlled by Kurdish force, not the Assad regime. And this camp was opened in the early 90s for first Gulf War. And then most of resident was the Iraqis and the Iraqi Kurds. And it's still there, but residents are different. Now we'll move on to presentation from Mr. Kamaluddin. No, I'm sorry. Mr. Shperi, do you have some final comments to conclude the ICRC part?
Well, actually, just also thanking, of course, Tomoko, for first-hand experience in the camps, and thanking you for explaining that particular situation. Indeed, al-Hol exists for a long time, but it was with the fall of Islamic State in March 2019 that you suddenly had these huge numbers of people coming in. That's why you suddenly have not just al-Hol, but other camps as well as in prisons with 100,000 people there, and humanitarians having to deal with this very, very unusual, unprecedented situation, particularly in the composition of the people that are living there. Al-Hol, as you said, it's actually about 30,000 Iraqis in the camp. The rest are well over 25,000 Syrians, and the rest are all these foreign nationals, all countries of the world, if you so wish. And I mean, what Tomoko has said, I think we developed many programs, and actually even in the months we continue to develop further activities. But if I just give one example, I was up there the last time maybe 6 weeks ago, and I was very happy to see, for example, in that annex where you have the foreigners, that we did have mobile health units there where the women and the children come. But it was nice to see that we had a psychologist sitting on a carpet with the children doing drawings, and we have also these programs in our hospital for the children. But I was really, my heart was really touched when I saw that these children who do not in that annex have any kind of schooling, but they were doing drawing, 2-3-year-old children, and all of their drawings when drawing a house were very strange because the houses didn't really look like houses. And I was asking our psychologist, why do they not draw like my children used to draw houses? And what I, of course, then quickly realized is that some of these children just have never seen a house in their life. And this is sad. And as I said, even if the humanitarians will be doing more and helping, it's never going to be a good solution to have those children up there in the northeast Syria. There is no solution there for them. So that's why we have to all work, all diplomatic, all efforts to find an adequate solution for this very difficult humanitarian problem. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shuperi. Now we'll move on to presentation from Mr. Yasser Kamaluddin of MSF Syria. Mr. Kamaluddin, it's your time.
Hello, thank you so much, Mr. Kandu. Before we start, there's a short video I want to show that summarizes the different phases of the conflict in Syria and how each phase had its particularities, let's say, with the humanitarian needs. So can you please play the video on the second slide?
What if you watched your country erupt in war, and 10 years later, the conflict is still raging, MSF has worked in Syria for the past 10 years. Today, Syrians are struggling to survive. 2011 to 2013, large protests turn into violence and then war. MSF provides support to Syrian doctors and runs underground hospitals to treat the wounded. 2014 to 2015, millions flee their homes, leading to the biggest displacement crisis since World War II. MSF starts providing medical care for Syrian refugees in neighboring countries. 2016 to 2018, bombing, shelling, and missile strikes destroy entire cities. Military offensives force MSF to withdraw medical teams from most of the country. 2019 to 2021, Syrians across the country struggle to survive. Millions live in camps for displaced persons. A decade of war has caused a health catastrophe, leaving physical and mental wounds that will take years to heal.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, again, depending on where you are following us. It's my pleasure to join this conference in its second edition this year and to discuss the situation in Syria together with the diverse audience and my colleagues on the panel. So as we saw in the video, 10 years of conflict, 10 years of different particular humanitarian situations. The needs have changed over those 10 years, and the humanitarian system had to adapt depending on the different levels of access that were allowed in this highly insecure context. So today I will briefly discuss with you the following topics. I will go through the programs that MSF is supporting, mostly in North Syria, and the complex humanitarian crisis that we see today. I will focus a bit on the situation in the displacement camps, the very poor condition in the displacement camps, and with more of focus on the northwest part of Syria, since also my colleagues from ICRC summarized very well the complicated situation on the northeastern side. So to show the numbers, first, it's important to understand the figures to comprehend the scale of the conflict and the crisis that we're talking about. So we're talking about more than 13 million Syrians displaced either inside Syria or globally as refugees because of the conflict. It's important, again, to keep in mind those figures to understand the scale of the crisis we're dealing with in Syria, but it's equally important not to lose the connection with the human side behind and the human stories behind those numbers, which is the essence of humanitarian aid. Those are people who lost their loved ones, who were forced to leave their houses because of the conflict, and many of them are trapped as we speak today in situations and in areas that they cannot escape from the ongoing conflict. MSF is operational in northeast and northwest Syria, in areas that are not fully under the control of the government today, providing a wide range of activities, medical and supportive public healthcare interventions in the camps, ranging from mobile clinics and fixed clinics in the camps, the displacement camps, and the urban centers of the areas where we work in. Also running regular vaccination programs, which are still hugely needed during a protracted conflict. We have also a big focus on the water provision in the displacement camps. This is one of the highest needs today, if we can look at it this way, in northwest Syria. And in such a volatile and rapidly evolving context, emergency preparedness, so the preparedness for sudden and unexpected changes, has been part of the program designing of MSF and all the other humanitarian actors to be able to respond in this complex situation. So it's indeed a very complex humanitarian crisis. And by complex, we mean that it's multi-faceted. There are a lot of factors that contribute to the vulnerability of the population in Syria today. It's a protracted emergency, which affected the ability of the population to cope with the crisis. Also, the ability of the donors, the aid actors to respond effectively to the needs of the population. The armed conflict never stopped throughout the years of the war in Syria. So even when we have a ceasefire, there is still a maintained baseline of hostilities that never stops, even if the front line and the areas of control are not changing. Every conflict wave is accompanied by a wave of displacement, where people are leaving their homes and camps of displacement time and again with every wave of conflict. I will discuss later the latest wave of displacement in Northwest Syria. Again, the population that we're dealing with is a trapped population. They do not have access to exercise their legal right to seek asylum in neighboring countries, with the closed borders, with the confined areas that they work in, and even sometimes with the confined camps where they are living. The economic situation that we saw over the last year is unprecedented. And even during the long time of the war in Syria, what happened in the last year in terms of economic deterioration is unprecedented. And this had a cross-line impact. This was one factor that affected the Syrian population in all of Syria. It affected their ability to cope with the crisis, their ability to buy from their pockets the essential needs, even if they had it before. The economic deterioration affected that further. And we'll see later the numbers. The children and women, they are the vast majority of the displaced population, which increases the vulnerability as we see it. And also it imposes unsustainable and dangerous coping mechanism on the displaced population. So to go and focus on the northwest of Syria, which is the last area that is still controlled by the opposition. It includes an area that is controlled by the opposition together with Turkish-controlled areas. There is more than 4 million people. More than half of them are displaced, which means that they come from other areas of Syria and were displaced by the different waves of the conflict. 1.6 million out of the population, this is a huge number, 1.6 million are living in displacement camps in very poor conditions. And 80%, between 70 and 80% of the population in the camps are women and children. This is something that reflects, for example, on the rate of early marriage and early pregnancies, and the depending medical complications that come with that, which is one of the coping mechanisms of the displacement crisis. So the latest wave of displacement in the northwest of Syria was accompanied with the latest wave of violence in the northwest of Syria. Between December 2019 and March 2020, there is almost 1 million people that were displaced from their homes, whether in cities or IDP camps, to areas that are adjacent to the border with Turkey. Please take a moment to reflect on this number. Almost 1 million people were displaced in a period between 3 and 4 months. That's a huge number. And we saw that those people were going to camps that are already dense, that are already full of displaced populations. The situation in these camps is very, very poor in terms of hygiene situation. To share with you some figures, 70% of the populations in the camps are completely reliant on daily water trucking, and this, of course, is impacted by the available funding. Only half are estimated to have access to both soap and sufficient hand washing facilities. Such a simple thing, but also a key public health measure that is crucial, especially in the times of COVID-19. In some camps, up to 180 people have to share a single toilet, and they are all vulnerable to the extreme weather conditions, whether floods and hypothermia in winter or heat strokes in summer. These are all conditions that we see in our mobile clinics and in our hospitals near the displacement camps. With COVID-19, although this is a global issue of concern, an issue of global concern that affects everyone, you can imagine how it impacts the already vulnerable population in the camps. it's impossible to practice the precautionary measures that are advised by the healthcare professionals everywhere around the world. If you live in a displacement camp, you cannot exercise social distancing. You cannot wash your hands if you don't have access to soap, to water, even to drink. So the situation in the camps during the COVID-19 is especially vulnerable, if I may say it like that. So to sum up, the situation in Syria today is characterized by very challenging access constraints, a long period of insecurity, and limited resources and increasing gaps because of that. The volume of available aid from the donors is decreasing. We started seeing some healthcare facilities on the ground in areas like Idlib that are stopping to receive patients because they don't have available funds. Also, some of the camps are not receiving regular water because of the unavailability of funds. The water, especially water, similar to what's happening in the Northeast, especially water, it's very much affected by the availability of donations. There is one thing that I want to put a bit of focus on, and perhaps we can discuss it more in the questions and answers. It's related to the access and the modalities of aid delivery. The northwest of Syria is very dependent on the cross-border humanitarian assistance that comes from Turkey based on the UN Security Council resolution in 2014 that allowed the UN and humanitarian actors to cross goods in areas that are not controlled by the government. Now, in 2 months from now, this United Nations Security Council resolution will be discussed either for renewal or discontinuation. And in an area like Northwest Syria, of course, it's key to explore all available modalities, but the cross-border cannot be replaced at the moment. And last but not least, the attacks on humanitarian aid is a worrying and sad fact, I would say. The colleagues earlier in the opening session today discussed at length the UN Security Council resolution 2286 in 2016. Only in 2020, the WHO recorded 28 attacks on healthcare. So it's a sad reality that we're dealing with today. Thank you very much. And yeah, to sum up, I would say that it's important, while the long-term political solution is being discussed, it's important to make sure that the population in need today have access to the essential and life-saving humanitarian aid to live with dignity and to be able to survive this brutal war. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Kando.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamal al-Din. Finally, Dr. Hamza, now floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everyone. Like, you literally left me nothing to say, actually. You summarized most of the stuff. And thank you also for the kind of briefing of the Syria situation and how it started. It looks very complicated at the moment. However, in 2011, it was kind of very simple demands, very peaceful protests. And then the longer it takes to find a resolution of it, then also other countries kind of kept discussing what to do and how to interfere, etc., the more complicated it is. I would focus more about the attacks on healthcare, basically, because this is kind of my experience working as a doctor in Aleppo for 4 years. So I'd like to start with a video captured from the CCTV of Al-Quds Hospital on the 27th of April, 2016, when the attack happened. So I hope our colleagues can share that. Since it's from the CCTV, so there is no sound, I'll try to briefly explain. So this is from the outside of the hospital, and you can see some of the floors of the hospital. It was 4 floors. There was an attack nearby the hospital first. That's why there are some people were wondering what's going on in this situation, but it was kind of 300 meters away, which is usual in living in a conflict area. There are attacks and mortars happens. But it was kind of a normal day, admitting patients to the ward, treating patients at the ER. This is Dr. Mohammed Wasim Maaz. He's a pediatrician that was killed during that attack. And he's walking from the pediatric ICU, basically to move his car from front of the hospital. Because of the previous attack, they just thought that it's better like just to move most of the cars from front of the hospital, which are like three cars particularly. Like there's not a huge like car like lots there. Few seconds, the attack gonna happen now, and you can see now like the effects basically on that attack. You can see afterward how like people really like are shocked. They know that hospital was a dangerous place to stay in, but they have no alternative basically. And you can see how like the patients, the relatives like just don't know what to do. The hospital entrances were completely blocked. There was around 53 people were killed, 7 from the staff and the rest from the neighbors of the hospital, basically of the neighbors building. The car you can see in the front is Dr. Muhammad Wasim Maaz's car, and he was nearby it when the attack happened. And we'll talk like a little bit later about like the responses from NGOs, from the governments, and like this, like how the situation is. But this is basically what is felt like to be a healthcare provider in conflict, where hospitals are continuously being attacked. You're living like in a continuous danger. You had no idea when the horror from the sky gonna hit, and people has no alternatives. I'm gonna share my presentation that I prepared and try to be like a little bit quick, because also we have only 2 minutes. Full screen. Yeah. So basically, regarding like the armed conflict and health, I just like briefly want to mention about like when you're considering talking about health in a conflict area, you need always to talk or to think about the other determinants and the social determinants of health in this area. So like the economy, the education, the like social content, the food, and the physical like environment, which are like usually all are affected during conflict, especially like during COVID situation. Like that's like those kind of like social determinants are affected a lot, and we've seen this in whole countries. So imagine that in a conflict area. And it was like briefed also a lot about like during this session about like how each area kind of in Syria has kind of like a different governance, which means like different situations. So we can't kind of like talk about health in Syria as whole one unit, which like my colleagues explained that like amazingly in their presentations. But like there are the Syrian like government controlled areas, and also like when we talk about COVID situation, about the reports there, that usually like you can't trust about the numbers and about like the measures to tackle the like COVID cases and all of this. They're all different in each area, and also like the social determinants of health also like different in each area. So we'll have like the governance, the northeast Syria, and we have also the Turkish controlled areas in the north, and of course like the northwest Syria. I won't talk more about it. We can, like, as I said, like my colleagues has explained that very, very well. Regarding the attacks on healthcare and the attacks in general during conflict. So according to the UN, when explosive weapons are used on those populations, 90% of those killed or injured are civilians. And we had like a common saying in Aleppo that the safest place to live at or stay nearby is the front lines. We knew that like the Russian and the Syrian regime main targets would be the civilians neighborhood, would be like schools, bakeries, hospitals, while it's very safe to stay close to the front lines. And like analysis happened between 2011, 2016 of the conflict in Syria, of children killed, blast injuries caused, were responsible for more than 83% of children death compared to explosive weapons being responsible for 12% of combatant killed. So basically, like also kind of like children are more affected even than the fighters involved in this fighting. So it's not kind of like just like a pure frontline and there are like militias fighting each other. The civilians, especially children, are affected. They're like nearly 7 times, the children 7 times more likely to have died from blast injuries than adults involved in fighting. So not only like just adults involved in fightings. Till the moment, like estimated 500 Syrians are killed, around 30 to 55,000 children killed in Syria conflict. And because of those attacks on healthcare, there is like the WHO has their own mechanism of reporting of the attacks on healthcare. And in that dashboard, like number of attacks in 2011, there was like a total of 388 attacks. And you can see that Syria like had like the vast majority of those attacks on healthcare. So like basically attacks on healthcare in Syria was kind of like a systematic action done particularly by the Syrian regime and the Russian against the hospitals in a non-government controlled area. And then the deconfliction mechanism come, where basically we, like the UN has asked the NGOs and WHO to provide a list of hospitals in Syria to be shared by the conflict parties. But since we're talking about conflict parties, we're talking basically about the Russian and the Syrian. The other parties are just militia, so there's no way of sharing those information with. And basically then what happened is that the UN has provided the Russian with like a attack list. Like it was just a menu of hospitals when like just to be attacked. All of those hospitals, or to be more particular, most of them were bombed. Physicians for Human Rights has kind of like reported that total attacks, like 348 attacks on medical facilities in Syria from March 2011 till May 2018. Nearly 900 medical workers are reported to have lost their lives in their attacks, and of course, like more number of injured. A total of 509 of incidents registered. 90% of them were traced to the Syrian government or its allies. And like in Aleppo, for example, we were sieged for 6 months. Our hospital, Al-Quds Hospital, was the last standing hospital in the city. It was the only hospital that wasn't attacked by the aircrafts there. And like I remember after 5 months of siege, I received a call from WHO, and the colleague was saying like we got like an idea to protect the hospital, and we couldn't think of anything more. And I was really keen like to know, because it's literally like the last hope for the city, for the civilians to be treated in a decent place. And their idea was like he literally said like we were in a conversation with the Russian. They don't know exactly, like they said that they don't know exactly where the hospital is, and it might be accidentally targeted, and would love you like to share the coordinates of the hospital with us in order to share it with the Russian. And I was literally shocked, like after kind of like, that was 2016. So after like 5 years of conflict, after most of the hospitals have been attacked clearly by the Russian and the Syrian regime, and then this is the only solution that kind of like the UN or the WHO have. It was literally like show how kind of like, I don't know, handcuffed they are, and like they literally can't move or provide any other solutions. And I remember I only told the person that if the hospital was attacked after that, would your statement clearly said that the hospital was attacked after sharing the location with the Russian? Or you're always gonna use the passive voice tone, being neutral about that attack too, and say, oh, it's the hospital was attacked. And he said, like, we can't say that. We can't even state a fact that the hospital was attacked after the location was shared with the Russian. And like, it was like, I was really shocked. And I know that like, we're doomed that day. A couple of weeks later, we were displaced out of the city. The Physician for Human Rights has like traced most of the attacks, and you can see like the total attacks was 583. Most of them here are responsibility by the Syrian government forces or the Syrian government Russian forces. We're talking about more than 90% of those attacks. Anti-government armed groups were responsible for 24, Islamic State ISIS were responsible for 10, and international forces were responsible for 4. They want you to remember this figure here, like unknown was only 20, which is less than 3% of the attacks were unknown, like the source of the attack was unknown. And I'll talk that like later why I want you to remember this figure. The idea then of underground facilities came, and we started to think about like literally creating facilities under the ground. It was a struggle to get funds for that because most of health like NGOs has like very clear allocation of funds, and construction is not one of them usually. So it took like a couple of years until like those NGOs developed and convinced donors that this construction is needed in Syria. One of the quotes from Dr. Abdullah Darwish, manager of al-Kateab hospital in Hama, staff feel safer in Cave. You don't see the raw fear in the eyes of the staff in the cave as I see in other hospitals. Basically, you can't see the aircrafts flying or helicopters flying above you, throwing explosive barrels, and you're just like counting seconds until the attack happens. I'll show you some pictures of hospitals in Aleppo. There were like clearly hospitals, decent hospitals. It's not kind of like a caravan or a tent that were like accidentally attacked. This was like M10 hospital in Aleppo. This is like the laboratory, operation room. And after attack on that hospital in 2016, during like the regime attack on the city, this is what is left of the hospital. Same thing regarding Al-Quds hospital. We used like just to put sandbags to protect the walls of the hospital. That was like the only solution we have. And you can see like, I'm really proud of making that hospital during conflict in a nearly sieged city like Aleppo. And you've seen the video of the attack, and this is what is left of the hospital. This is the car of Dr. Muhammad Wasim that was killed during that hospital. The doctor was like accused, like in whole regime media, that he was a terrorist doctor. And my usual response, like he was a pediatrician. Like even if he wanted like to treat terrorists, he won't know how to do that. And unfortunately, like the report, like the statements from most of NGOs and the UN, WHO, etc., about that attack, it was clear, like just mentioning like the hospital was attacked. There was no clear, like not even like a slightly mention of like attacked by an aircraft. And from my perspective, and a lot of my colleagues' perspective, that's like misleading a lot. When people like in 10 years want to search those documents and then found like, oh, there's a conflict in Syria, people were killing each other, hospitals were attacked, and then that's it. While 90% of the attacks on hospitals were like responsibility of the Syrian regime and the Russian, only 3% were unknown. But the vast majority of statements stated as like unknown. We don't know who's attacking those hospitals. It's clearly like it was an aircraft. And it's clearly that in Northwest Syria, only Russian and Syrian regime aircrafts are like allowed to fly there. While in Northeast Syria, basically like the American and like the Alliance, Atlantic like Alliance are allowed to fly there. In North Syria, it's Turkish. Like it was kind of like, doesn't need like a huge investigating to know about that attack. But talking about like the UN agencies reports and how like being neutral is not really like kind of serving the truth. After like the displacement of Aleppo, this is what UNHCR statements were. For example, like on Twitter, the UNHCR saying like, after years of darkness, city of Aleppo is lit at night. We hope that Syrians find light at the end of the tunnel finally. And as a person who is displaced from Aleppo, he's forced, like was nearly killed for providing medical care assistance for the Syrian citizen, and then forced to be displaced out of the city. I found this like tweet very like irresponsible, very disrespectful for the people and friends and colleagues who were killed in the city. Like we weren't like the party that cutting electricity of the city. It was the Syrian regime that is cutting the electricity as part of like basically way to make the areas like the non-government control areas struggle more. They were cutting like electricity, water, not allowing any aid assistance during siege. But yet after the displacement, the UN showed us as kind of like a victory for humanity. Like after years of darkness, city of Aleppo is lit at night. And another like tweet also, like life is slowly returning to the destroyed city of Aleppo. For the full story, check our Instagram, etc. Like why it's slowly returning to destroyed city, why it's destroyed. It's not just happened to be destroyed. We didn't like just wake up and found it destroyed by a volcano or an earthquake. It was destroyed because of the continuous attacks of the regime and the Russian. And then like phrasing the statements like this, very like, I really have no words to describe like how frustrated a lot of Syrians found those statements are. And we don't like, I don't want UNHCR people to march in the streets of Damascus claiming for dignity and accountability, etc. But even in this tweet, like we hope that Syrians find light at the end of the tunnel and accountability happen. That will satisfy me. But even that like small demand, like they are too neutral to speak about. The UNICEF during the siege of Al-Ghouta had made a statement about what's going on. Like no words would do justice to the children killed. They're just like children happen to be killed there. Their mothers, their fathers, and their loved one. And then that's it. Like even an activist would be ashamed of that, of that statement. And of course, like the UNICEF, like it came from Amman because they can't make it coming from Damascus. Otherwise, their mission gonna be shot by the Syrian regime because they are not neutral. And like another like here it was like a tweet, when adults keep killing children without being held accountable, when it's children who save other children's life, there is no words. And this is like an attack in Idlib city, northwest Syria, clearly done by the Syrian regime or the Russian. Under the rebels, there was a stuck like 4 years young lady, and out of the rebels, she was holding her brother from falling down. And a couple of weeks later, both of them were dead. They couldn't make it. And this tweet don't do justice for them. And it's not like adults killing children. It's not like adults killing children in Syria. No, this is not the situation. It's Syrian regime, Russian aircrafts attacked a civilian neighborhood in Idlib. End of the story. This is what happened. And this kind of tweets, like just like misleading the facts. I don't want to like sound very personal, but you can feel like my frustration sitting here as a refugee in London because I'm considered as a like terrorist doctor in the eye of the Syrian government. Why Mr. like Philip sitting there in my country in Damascus because he's neutral. And I'm not gonna like, I'm not saying like he's doing something wrong because like I don't like, if you read Mr. Philip like CV and achievements, like no one can doubt like the amazing achievements for humanity and the humanitarian aid that he's doing. But I'm talking about the system itself that make you like forced to be silenced in this situation, that basically the aid organizations, the international aid organizations, the UN agencies are taking hostages by the dictatorship regime in Syria and all other rest of the world. And basically like same thing at their citizens. And the only way to keep this like aid flow to those dictatorship areas is by keeping completely silent about what they are seeing in their own eyes. And like, as I said, like I don't want like the UN agencies to protest in Damascus, but like a simple acknowledgement that this is the situation that is happening, and this is how they are like held hostages, being kept silent, is like at least like necessarily for everyone to be aware of. One quote I really prefer like about that, like if you are neutral in situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality for sure. So thank you all for tuning in and for listening. I hope I wasn't like boring. And after 10 years, like the fact that we are still discussing the effect of such like attacks is a point of shame for humanity. Governments must come together to take international action to protect civilians from the harm caused by use of explosive weapons, chemical attacks, sieging of cities, displacement, forcing people to be displaced of their hometowns, wherever or by whomever they are used. And to our fellow members in medical community, NGOs, like healthcare workers around the globe. I ask that you join like Action for SEMA in this demand. Solidarity from colleagues across the world is needed too, now more than ever. Wherever we work in peaceful conditions or under a threat of bombs, we must all stand together as healthcare workers in demanding an end of this cycle of destruction that concerns us all. Thank you very much again. Like, if you want more information, I urge you please to watch for SEMA film to see like the situation in Aleppo for 4 years and how we lived there. And there are so many reports about attacks on healthcare, like investigations. The New York Times recent one in 2019 was like amazing investigations regarding like focused attack on healthcare and healthcare providers. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamza. Thank you very, very much. Actually, now we slightly changed this schedule and we'll move on to the question and answer session. But before moving that, I personally want to ask Dr. Hamza, that how is your daughter doing after the film now? And second question is that some people may think, then let the government rule all Syria, then the war is over. But I don't think this is this might not be the full restoration peace. And why you don't go back to Syria right now?
So regarding Sema and Taima, they're doing well. They're going to schools now here in the UK. They start to have this like weird British accent, which is like concerning me and her mother a lot. And we keep like reminding them that we came from Syria, we're not here from London, and like keeping just reminding them. Sema is aware that there is a film called For Sema. She's very like proud of it. She keep like nagging her sister, teasing her that it's called For Sema, not For Taima. So like, yeah, I win. And yeah, like they can't remember. Basically, Sema was 1 year old when we were displaced, so she can't really like. She had some nightmares at the early like following 6 months. We like asked several like colleagues, pediatricians, and psychotherapists. They said like children kind of like see nightmares if they like grow up in like these situations of like continuous bombing and like hearing those sounds. But thanks God now like everything is fine. Why we don't back to Syria? I wish I've risked my life to stay in Syria basically. I've risked my life during siege and attacks to be in my city. But the options were like, then the regime gonna take over. They treat all healthcare providers as terrorists. If you are like, since you are in a non-government controlled area, you're a terrorist, that's it. So like the only option was to be displaced. And I don't think like, yeah, kind of like the situation gonna be ended if just the government changed, but at least it is a start. It is a start of like accountability. It's not like a magic stick, like you're gonna end everything. Like the wound is so deep and pierced. Like it's like the war crimes that happened there, and I can't say by all parties, because like we'll say like 90% of them by the Syrian regime and the Russian, and there are also other parties accountable for those war crimes. They need like, the Syrian people need like a simple sense of accountability so they can really like then move on. But definitely change over the government that were responsible of most of the attacks, of like arresting more than 200,000 people. Most of their families had no idea where they are now, or at least if they are like alive or not. Like this is like kind of like a simple start of accountability.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Okada that in the camp, how does COVID-19 affect your activity and people's life? 日本語でいいですよ。
はい、キャンプ内でもコロナウイルス感染者が報告されていました。私たちの病院では入り口でトリアージを行っていました。で、感染が疑われる患者がいれば、キャンプ内の隔離センターに送りました。しかし、私たちがセンターに送ろうとしても拒否して帰宅する人もいました。センターに入院した人々は診断を確定するためにコロナウイルス検査を受けるようでした。また、来院者の中でマスクをつけている人々はほぼゼロに近かったですし、 キャンプ住民の中にコロナ感染に対する緊張感はあまり感じられませんでした。たとえキャンプの住民が感染予防しようと思っても、ソーシャルディスタンスを保つことや手洗いをこまめにすることは難しく、心配しても仕方がないと思われているのかもしれません。
ありがとうございます。Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now there's a question for Mr. Yassel. That the question goes that I would like to ask Mr. Yassel that how MSF protect staff and patients from attacks on healthcare and project in Syria. What precaution do you take? And may I add that especially MSF is protecting without arms. How do you protect yourself in armed conflict without arms?
Yeah. Thank you for this question. This is a very good point, and it's one of the key challenges that we face in Syria and in other locations with similar instability and volatile conditions. So we rely mainly in our activities in unstable areas in the proximity with the local population and the connection with all the actors on the ground. So it's basic impartiality. One of the main principles of humanitarian aid is, for the aid to be available for all those who need it on the ground. And in areas that are more insecure, whether it's a conflict, an international or a national armed conflict, or whether it's high local insecurity, for us, from the long experience that MSF has in working in unstable situations, the no weapons policy and the proximity and the acceptance from the local community, this has proved to be the most efficient way of ensuring the safety of the patients and the safety of our staff. So in practice, this would mean regular engagement with the local community, involving this acceptance and thinking about this acceptance as a key component of any design of activity. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, this is a question from audience to Mr. Speri. This may be somehow political, but if you could. I have a question to Mr. Speri. How former personnel of foreign origin and children in the camp be treated in the future?
Well, I think in my response, I had provided elements to it. I mean, for the moment, we are facing a situation that, let's say, these people, the children, women, all the populations there are really stranded there. And we have seen over the past, 2.5 years since this big situation occurred, that only very, very few are actually being repatriated. It's going too slow. The numbers are not big. So our policy call has always been calling on states that the first thing is to really find and push and find ways to bring them back. And as long as they're not brought back, the only thing we can do is on the humanitarian side is just trying to provide the kind of services that are needed there. But always recalling this is a closed camp environment, and I mentioned that, like for children, this will never be the appropriate thing for children to live. So again, finding solutions, for them to be able to leave this environment, return to a more stable situation where government states can make sure that they receive the kind of life and the dignity that children and such people need to have. So that's the answer. But I saw there was also one other question. I said, because I referred to the fact that we have included further programs, including mental health care programs for the ICRC. There's not that long a tradition, but we've seen that it's absolutely necessary to do that there. But there are, of course, many other needs that need to be further developed in that environment. So I hope that gives at least an element of response to the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is the question about COVID-19. The question goes, I assume that a UN-led vaccination scheme, COVAX, will be provided mostly for those residing under regime-controlled areas, and not to those who are residing elsewhere. I'm particularly concerned of the resident residing in northeast Syria of the Kurdish Autonomous Region, as I know that vaccination provided by WHO were not always provided in this region, even in the past. What are some of the initiatives taken by the international community, knowing that this is the situation? Or what are some of the initiatives that should take place in an ideal world? So I think I would address Mr. Yassel to ask about the situation of vaccination in northeast and northwest Syria.
I think I can comment also more in details on the situation in northwest Syria. Yes. with the recent updates. So very recently, at the end of April, more than 50,000 doses of vaccination arrived in northwest Syria. It arrived through the COVAX facility, and that's the importance of such an international mechanism for the distribution of vaccines, because without the COVAX facility and with no officially recognized state actor in northwest Syria, the population there would have been left without vaccines. Still, this is unfortunately affected by the global supply problem of the COVID-19 vaccines that also affects the COVAX facility. So it's going slower than it should. And I'm afraid that by the end of this year, we'll be looking for a situation where many countries around the world will be vaccinating the non-priority and the low-risk population, while still in area like northwest Syria, the elderly, those with comorbidities, with high-risk factors, are not vaccinated yet because of how it is like. One last thing about this point is that the particularity of the area that is not controlled by a recognized state actor is that they don't have an alternative. They cannot negotiate for vaccines directly for the local population because they do not have this access to the global market. So they're solely dependent on the COVAX facility and on the cross-border mechanism also, by the way.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Speri, do you have some comments?
Well, again, I mean, you know, the organization's best place would here be, of course, WHO, but also UNICEF, who are playing a very big role in this distribution. I think, adding to Yasser's comment, I think for you know, for the government of Syria areas, but also the northeast, actually, we have also just seen very recently, like in the northwest, the arrival of the first vaccines. So it's not a very big number yet. I think the plan was for the first months, I think, with COVAX to reach 3% of the population. Right now, the first batch of vaccines have arrived, and the first ones to receive them are sort of call them frontline or medical personnel working, you know, directly with patients, and also you know, elderly people and people with particular vulnerabilities. So some have now arrived in the government areas, but as well, I think that's in agreement with the government as well as with the administration in the Northeast and WHO. This batch also has reached the Northeast. So that is actually coordinated and controlled. But again, as I understand, this is a first small batch. The perspectives of reaching the whole Syrian population, I think, is still very far away. So this is, of course, a start, but this is a very small number, and it definitely is going to be very slow. At least that's what I can say for now.
If I just want to add, like, briefly, basically, since the UNICEF and the UN, like WHO, are responsible for this, so there are basically main two hubs for vaccines to enter Syria. One, Turkey hub through like cross-border. The only allowed route at the moment is to the northwest Syria. There was previously 4 routes, but then as a Security Council resolution, they were vetoed by the Russian and Chinese like several months ago, and only like 1 route is now applicable. Then the second hub is Damascus hub, that basically gonna be distributed inside like the government controlled area and north East Syria, since the government like can't enter those. And that's why also like explaining a little bit like why more vaccinations are going to the government area, since like non-government areas has only one like entry point from the border. I think the estimate is like by 2026 when the whole population of Syria going to be vaccinated, which is like way too long.
5 years later. Oh, unbelievable. May I ask one thing to Dr. Okada? Because it's a rare occasion to hear, live account. So can you share us a story about some people or patient you met in the camps that you cannot forget?
はい。私が今も心配している患者さんの中に、ロシア出身の27歳の女性がいます。彼女によると、彼女はキャンプに来る以前に HIV キャリアと診断されたそうです。衰弱していた彼女を善意が見つけ、私たちの病院に入院しました。入院時、歩行障害、手指の運動障害、上肢の痛みが認められました。これらの症状は HIV 感染に関連したものである可能性がありました。彼女によると、彼女はロシアの孤児院で育ち、結婚後、シリアに来ました。シリアに一緒に来た夫は戦死し、再婚相手は現在刑務所に収容されているそうです。彼女はとても愛らしく控えめな女性です。入院時、彼女は何も持っていなかったので、私が必要なものを聞くと、歯ブラシ、歯磨き粉、櫛と答えてくれたので、彼女に渡しました。その後も彼女に必要なものがないか聞くと、彼女は毎回にっこり微笑んで、もう十分と答えました。私は彼女が遠慮していると思い、衣類やカバン、お菓子、果物を渡すと、彼女はにっこり微笑んで毎回喜んでくれました。彼女は絵や手芸の才能があり、入院中私に美しい絵や刺繍や歯切れで作った可愛い人形などをプレゼントしてくれました。入院して1ヶ月半後、彼女は体力を回復し、支えがなくても復興できるようになり、退院しました。彼女が HIV に対する薬物療法を WHO から受けるためには、確定診断のために血液検査を受ける必要があります。彼女の入院中に検体をダマスカスに送る手配をすることができなかったので、退院後も彼女に毎週通院してもらいました。しかし、WHO とタイミングよく連絡を取ることができなくて、彼女に検査を待つようお願いする日が続き、とうとう1ヶ月半後、彼女は来院しなくなりました。私たちが彼女のいるアネックスに行って彼女を見つけることはできないので、彼女が来院するをひたすら待っていましたが、私は彼女に再会することなく帰国することになりました。帰国後も私の同僚に彼女のフォローアップをお願いしていますが、今のところ彼女が来院したという話は聞いていません。一番気になっている患者さんです。
ありがとうございます。Thank you very much. It's surprising. I've never imagined that there's a Russian HIV positive in the camp. It shows the complexity of this war. There are two questions to Dr. Hamza from the floor. The first one is that, okay, I'll read that again. When I saw the film for summer, I realized how much I was just an onlooker in Japan. I would like to ask, how did you get the medical supplies in Aleppo at that time? And also, are there dissidents who remained in Aleppo living safely now? The second question is that I would like to ask, when you were in Aleppo, have you seen or encountered MSF activities? If so, what did you think?
So yeah, the first part, like it was like based on the phase. So Aleppo is considerably like a little bit close to Turkish border. So it was easier kind of like to get medical supplies from there. We're talking about like 70 kilometers. There was like 2 access points at that time for NGOs to send like medical supplies, consumables, medical devices, etc. And the road to Aleppo was open. When the siege happened, roughly speaking, in July, 10th of July 2016, that was a complete cut of the roads of Aleppo. We couldn't get anything in or out of the city, but no injuries, not even like food, medical supplies, anything at all. So for 6 months, we kind of like had enough supplies, because NGOs usually work in sending stocks every like 3 months. They don't usually like purchase stocks every month. They do it like bulk every 6 months, 3 months, etc. So we had kind of like enough supply to survive. What was like worrying is we don't know, is that enough or not? So like we know we have, for example, like 1,000 normal saline, but then like, is that enough? We're not, when the siege gonna be like broken or open, when like AIDS gonna arrive? We had no idea. So that was kind of like we had to invent our own guidelines to reduce the amount of medications we use, because we had no idea if it was enough or not. You remind me of the other questions.
Have you seen MSF activities when you were in Aleppo? That was the question. What was the impression of what do you think about that?
Yeah, so completely being honest, not because like we're hosted by MSF here, like there was like one of the first who kind of arrived like in the city. I remember that was like early 2013. There was not a lot of like kind of I think the WHO hub in Gaziantep in Turkey wasn't like really evolved that time. Not a lot of like local NGOs were there. It was a little bit dangerous for international NGOs to come to enter the city, or even like the country. So MSF were the first considered like INGOs that started a medical facility there. They started their own medical facility in a Sheikh Najjar, which is like an industrial area in East Aleppo. We worked with them like together, like referring patients. Our hospital was mainly like internal pediatric hospital. So we cooperate a lot with them, because most of the other hospitals in the city was mainly like trauma focused, because that was like most of the donations coming towards. So we cooperate a lot with MSF hospital in Sheikh Najjar. Then the hospital was attacked by the Syrian regime or the Russian. There wasn't Russian that time, so it was clearly attacked by the Syrian regime. They had to move nearby the city, like near a village called Tel Rafat, and keep the hospital there. That was also threatened by ISIS. And then when they like completely kind of like moved, because it was like very risky, they moved to near the border where started the hospital there. So like they're very well known like for medical providers in Syria, and we worked a lot with them. We received a lot of donations also from them, medical supplies. They really helped in with medical devices after the attack of Al-Quds Hospital. They donated like worth about like $240,000 of medical devices to the hospital, which helped us in like staying in Aleppo and being like the last hospital there, basically.
Thank you very much. And there's another question that being in a conflict zone can be very stressful. Sometimes in such a situation, how do you deal with such mental health issues? Let's say Mr. Shperi and Mr. Yassel.
Well, again, I mean, it seems to have two dimensions. I mean, there's the question on mental health issues, you know, for
aid
the
workers.
If it's really for the aid workers ourselves, I think that, you know, that is a very important question, and we pay a lot of attention now in the ICRC to be very mindful of the stress that is there, and trying to take all kinds of measures that can help. It's the kind of breaks you can take. It's the kind of mindfulness also of the colleagues of what this stress can mean. It's paying attention to your life hygiene, call it. I mean, from nutrition to sleep, to breaks, but also having a team of mental health support around to see if there are particular issues. So there's a lot that one has to do personally, but there's also a great awareness that one needs among colleagues to be able to support the others, but also then as an organization to help in that domain. I mean, I started a long time ago with the ICRC working on this. I think that a lot more awareness about this has come, but it remains. I mean, we've seen just the pictures of Dr. Hamza. I mean, as much as you can do, the work and being exposed to certain situations is in itself very, 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 very difficult. So there's never the perfect answer, but there's a lot that one can do personally to manage one's life, to bear in mind and not be just completely eaten up by the stress. So it's the personal part, but it's also the way the institution can accompany it, also with professional help that is available. So that might be a few elements.
Thank you. Mr. Yassel, any comments?
Yeah, for us, I guess it's more or less the same mindset. Dealing with burnouts is one of the skills that you learn early on as a humanitarian aid worker. But this doesn't protect completely from what was mentioned. Burnouts, being working in a stressful environment for too long, and also we have the MSF Syrian and non-Syrian staff who are working on this conflict. If I want to give the example of our operations in Syria, and it's a different dynamic, because at the end you have the Syrian staff of MSF are dealing with it as a reality, as a daily reality that it extends beyond the work, beyond the working hours, if I may say so. So it's very difficult to approach. The way we deal with it is to be mindful of it as well, to make sure that we keep professional help with mental health support, stress support for the staff that would be available for whoever needs it, to be more aware of taking leaves when it's needed, of making sure that we have enough people to take care of this huge workload. There's never a good answer. I personally worked in areas like Afghanistan, in Iraq, and with the Syria crisis, and yeah, it's one of the things that you have to deal with in this kind of job, I guess.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. There is a question to Mr. Philip Speli. In the Brussels conference, the EU noted that there will be no fund reconstruction without a political solution. However, the rehabilitation of infrastructure, which may be a part of the reconstruction, like power station, water station, etc., is a basic need to protect access to healthcare, school, and have a dignity life for people. It seems that all humanitarian assistance becomes a part of politics. How can humanitarian organizations advocate international society to think of humanitarian assistance and politics separately? It's a tough question.
Yes, indeed, that's a tough question, and in the Syria situation, it's really a key question, because it is true that with the unresolved political situation in the country, positions by many countries are humanitarian assistance yes, reconstruction no. But what I was describing also in my presentation was to say that we are seeing in Syria is a country that has been built with very, very heavy centralized infrastructure, big power plants, big facilities that have been working, but have now been lacking investment. Large parts, some 50% of water stations and others have been destroyed, and what is running due to lack of funds is getting weaker. And then the question always is, for a humanitarian work, is humanitarian work just seen as digging a well or bringing in a package? Or is the humanitarian work also making sure that these facilities continue or can help continue running? Because if they're not running, you have no water in towns and cities in Damascus. So the question is this kind of repair work, is that reconstruction or is it humanitarian? So there's a big discussion around what is actually the definition of it, and we are definitely advocating for a position that should permit that such facilities keep going on, because once they fail, we've seen that in the Iraq context actually, where heavy infrastructure went down, and once it is down, you cannot repair it anymore. It needs massive billion dollars in investments, And what has happened if they break down is a huge humanitarian impact on persons. So it's really about the definition of what is reconstruction, what is humanitarian, and actually saying, and we in the past, we sometimes used words and saying, for us, this is humanitarian. It's basically, as long as the situation is not involved, at least hold what exists to not make it further deteriorate. But that can already, to keep things running, can actually mean quite big investments, and it's not what one would classically imagine as the humanitarian work. It's very important engineering work, and that's actually to a certain extent what our engineers are doing here. Again, it's a matter of definition and making a case for what we would actually see as required investment to prevent in the future a collapse of essential services in the country, which would have a massive humanitarian impact on top of all, the amount of suffering that already exists in Syria. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is a question to Dr. Hamza. If the conflict will be over, as you mentioned, everybody has each scar during a decade of this conflict, and it will be continuing for a long time. Could you give us your thought on how they can heal these wounds?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, to be honest. But like basically, as I said, like you can't, for example, said like all the 3 million that are part of the Syrian army like has committed war crimes and they need to be judged, etc. There's kind of like a chain of command accountability of the airstrike, for example, that attacked the healthcare, for the chemical weapons attack. There are like main incidents, like there are several massacres where children were slaughtered with knives. That was like by the Hezbollah or Iranian militias, even the Syrian regime army. So kind of like certain like steps of accountabilities, chasing the chain of commands, that will give like a sense of at least of justice for the Syrian people from all sides. There are like several like also war crimes committed by other militias that also like need to be traced. Some European countries have started to do that, like Germany, France, arresting some of like people who are like, involved in fighting, and there are like kind of some like documentations about them being involved in war crimes incidents. I guess like this is kind of a start, and like when a common ground, when like all Syrians feel like okay, justice at least has started to happen. That's like I think a common ground that all Syrians can stand on, and then like rebuild the country. Basically, it's a tricky question also about like the humanitarian aid and how like dictatorship regimes are benefits from that, but at the same time there are civilians living there. It's just like too complicated situation, and from my observations, like the international community is like helpless in this situation. There's no clear kind of direction or guidelines they can follow to get through this.
Thank you very much. There's another question about the ongoing politics, that Syria will hold the presidential election on 26th of May, and the media reports it's almost certain that Assad will win. How do Syrian people see this situation and the election? Maybe Dr. Hamza is appropriate.
Sorry, the voice a little bit cut out. Can you?
There will be a presidential election in Syria, and we all know that Assad is going to win. So how does the people in Syria see this situation, the election?
Like it just the same thing happening all over, like for the past actually 50 years, like since al-Assad father was in power for roughly speaking about like 30 years, and then now 20 years Bashar al-Assad. Like there is no question that he's going like to win this election. It's like maybe the second time when there are like other people like running against him, but like there is absolutely no question who's going to win. Like the other people are like not really known by anyone, like by Syrians or parties. We have only like one party that like controlling the state, and also the other parties which is al-Ba'ath Party, and basically like they run the country. Like now in Syria, like there are starts of talk of kind of like preparing his son to be like his successor, and his name also Hafiz al-Assad. So Bashar al-Assad's son to be like the successor after like maybe like the next 6 or 7 years. And it's all in media. Like it's not kind of like questionable thing that like we need like to have his like the inspiration leader of al-Assad family to keep running this city or this country.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a question to Mr. Speri. Goes enforced disappearance and tortures by secret police have been reported in Syria. Does the ICRC mandate include visit and protection of such facility and people? Can you comment on this?
Yeah. I had also again when I presented, I had given some indications on this. Well, I mean, first, it is true the International Committee of the Red Cross, you know, is a special institution in the sense that we actually do have under the Geneva Conventions certain prerogatives. And the ICRC actually, when it comes to interstate conflict, a conflict between two countries, and so-called prisoners of war are taken, that's where the ICRC, as an example, actually has a right to visit. So it's really like a monitoring body for that. When it comes to conflicts that are qualified as non-international in nature, and this would at least be mostly what is the situation in Syria related to persons you know, detained, for example, by the government of Syria or in the northeast Syria. It's you know, Syrian detention of Syrians mostly. Those are situations where we have a long history of visiting, and we have a right to ask the question whether we can visit, but there's no obligation to make a visit. So it has to be, in other words, negotiated. In Syria, there was, you know, there was not a practice, you know, before the conflict of access to detention places, security detention in Syria. It took up to 2015 until we had one breakthrough, is that we were granted access to visit central prisons in Syria, which are those under the Ministry of Interior. You call it the normal judicial kind of place where they put persons. So that access we have, and we visit like that many people in prisons under the government of Syria. But what we never were able to obtain is what you would call access to security and military detention. And that's, of course, you know, that would of course be very crucial, you know, to address the issues that you were mentioned. But to add, of course, that what we have also obtained meanwhile is in the northeast Syria. In those areas, we have, that's what I mentioned, access to the camps, but also the prisons. There we actually do have full access to look into the phenomenon, you know, into detention, the treatment of persons, and intervene on that. And that also, of course, does also have a link to the issue of people who have disappeared, who are missing, which is a very big activity of ourselves. We do collect allegations worldwide on persons missing and keep these keep track and try to pursue. But that's very long-term work that we're doing. Of course, we keep, and that's you know, we will keep trying and sparing no effort to see how and if we can you know, gain further access also in Syria. But again, this is just the situation as it is currently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these tough questions. Now time is running out. So can I have a final comments of each of panelists, beginning from Mr. Yasel, please? The final message to the audience today.
Sure. So obviously from the discussions we had today, the 10 years of conflict left the different areas in Syria and the people of Syria living in those areas in unimaginable level of needs. Now, the humanitarian aid assistance to these areas is more and more challenged every year, with limited access to some areas, with decreasing funds, in some other areas. And the ability to have access to all of the areas, as mentioned before. To give an example, in areas controlled by the government today, although MSF is not operational, for sure we are aware and we can expect that the needs are immense in areas that were affected by the conflict, but access there is an issue, at least for us at the moment. I would like to end by saying that the population of northwest Syria at the moment is depending on this cross-border resolution. We're talking about a huge logistic operation to sustain the lifeline for those camps, and this will be disrupted rapidly and intensely if the resolution is not continued in 2 months from now, when it's up for voting at the UN Security Council. All modalities should be explored, even cross-line modalities from Damascus, if that can work. But until it is a viable solution, a practical way to ensure that the needs of the people are still met is to continue renewing this cross-border, essential cross-border mechanism. That's it from my side, and thank you so much for listening today, and thank you so much for my colleagues on the panel for the great exchanges. Back to you, Mr. Kando.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yatser. Now, Dr. Okada 先生、最後に聴衆の皆さんにお伝えしたいことがあればお願いします。
私のシリアの友達の多くはもうシリアには将来はないと諦めているようなところがあります。で、友達の中には子どもたちの将来のためにもう国外に行くことを考えている人も少なくなくて、でも行きたいけどお金がないという、もう夢も希望もあまり持てないような状況にいるようで、もうなんとかできないか本当にやりきれない思いです。今日はありがとうございました。はい。
非常に率直なご意見。Thank you very much for your honest dialect comment. So, Dr. Hamza, any final words?
Thank you all very, very much. Briefly stating, as much as complicated the situation now is Syria, as much as it's very clear who the oppressors are and what war crimes has been committed by them. I really would encourage everyone, to have brainstorming about neutrality and what does it mean, and how it need to be dealt with in this situation, in order not to rephrase or reshape the truth of the attacks and incidents that happen. Also, since we're talking about 10 years in Syria, I would like to remind us all of another conflict or situation that's been happening for 70 years in Palestine, and the situation that's happening now on. So also please don't forget the Palestinians, that displacement is happening at the moment there. And thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Speri.
Yes, thanks. Well, thanks, of course, again for organizing this event. I mean, my message, very much to all who are listening is really, in having listened to all of us, is the realization that 10 years into this conflict, it is not over. There is no political solution, and despite that, in many areas, the fighting is not active. But you've seen that the map shows that there are still very many unresolved areas in the country. Is that actually, and very sadly, due to also other factors, particularly economic, the needs have actually been growing. And of course, we've seen it in other conflicts, is that with the time, interest might fade. There are other situations that are happening in the world. However, with the degradation that we have seen and that are foreseeable, if there is no political, positive political developments, is that this will continue to increase. So we're facing a situation of more humanitarian needs, and arguably with less means coming in. So that's going to increase the pressure. So the message is really continue to pay attention to Syria. One needs a lot of support in continuing to bring humanitarian aid into the country. while saying at the same time that, of course, all this has a limit. The solutions have to be politically. The humanitarians will not be able to make up, for a situation that really requires political solutions. But again, humanitarian aid and assistance is direly needed in Syria, and probably to a much larger degree than what we are seeing now. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to tell the people in Japan who were watching this that this unrest and conflict began around the time 2011, March 11, when the earthquake hit northern and eastern Japan. Nobody imagined that in Japan, including me. And nobody in Syria imagined what's going on 10 years later. And when I visited Syria same year later, people care about Japan, even though they are in a big trouble, serious trouble. And also, international community helped us during this earthquake, and also earthquake in Kumamoto. So what we see in Syria is maybe what we will be in near future if any earthquake or any other disaster takes place in this country. So they are us, we are them. We all connected and united. So please keep observing and keep watching Syria, DRC, Gaza, Yemen, Libya, Syria, anywhere. The world is connected. That's what I want to tell you. Thank you very much for gathering today. And I really love to hope that this would give you some insights. Thank you very much.